Commander Arlen stood on the bridge of the human warship Horizon, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines and the low murmur of human voices as the great vessel sailed through the endless void of space. The windows of the bridge stretched wide, showing an ocean of stars, yet even the stars were fading as a strange black mist began to swallow them one by one. The humans called it the Dark, and Arlen had heard many stories about it since the moment he joined the human fleet. Some said it was only a natural cloud of cosmic dust, while others swore it was alive and hungry. Arlen was not human. His tall frame and silver skin made him stand out among the crew. His own people were explorers who traveled between galaxies, but they rarely joined wars. Yet here, he was in the middle of one. His kind preferred logic and distance. Humans preferred passion and fire. He had studied them for years and wanted to understand their courage. So when the captain of the Horizon asked him to serve as a liaison between his people and the human fleet, he accepted. At first it seemed like an opportunity to observe them in battle, to watch their strategies and learn from their stubborn nature. Now with the black mist growing thicker outside, he wondered if he had made the right choice. The bridge crew worked in tense silence, their eyes fixed on the sensors. The mist was not only blocking the stars, it was swallowing light itself. The further they went, the darker it became, until the glow of the control panels felt like the only source of life around them. Arlen kept his gaze on the viewport, trying to see shapes in the swirling black. His people had advanced sensors far better than human tech, yet even they could not see through this strange shadow. It was as if the Dark was not simply hiding what was inside, but erasing it completely from existence. A soft voice broke the silence. It was Ensign Marlowe, a young human officer whose eyes always carried a hint of mischief even in dangerous times. But now they were wide with fear. She spoke quietly to Arlen, as if afraid the mist could hear her. She said that ships that entered the Dark never returned. She said her grandfather was on one of those ships many years ago. No wreckage was ever found. No signal. Nothing but silence. Arlen wanted to respond with logic and reason, but the way her voice trembled made him stay quiet. Sometimes logic was not what someone needed to hear. The captain stood at the center of the bridge, his tall figure unmoving, his eyes fixed on the growing darkness. Captain Rhodes was a man of few words and fewer smiles. He had faced pirates in the asteroid belts, alien raiders in the outer colonies, and even once fought a battle inside the atmosphere of a burning planet. Yet now Arlen could see his jaw tighten. Rhodes finally spoke, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. He said to keep the weapons ready. He said the Dark was not empty. And he said if they saw movement, they should fire without hesitation. The words settled over the crew like a heavy blanket. Everyone knew what that meant. The rumors about the Dark were not just tales told in mess halls. Something lived in there. Something dangerous enough to make even the most experienced captain give such an order. Arlen moved closer to the viewport, trying to pierce the black mist with his eyes. But all he saw was shifting nothingness, the kind that made the mind imagine shapes where there were none. Yet he felt something, not with his eyes, but deep inside, a pressure in the air, as if the ship was being watched. The sensors began to beep, slow at first, then faster. The technician at the console looked up with wide eyes. She said there was movement ahead. No heat signature, no metal reading, just something large and moving fast. Arlen leaned forward, his sharp alien eyes trying to focus. In the mist, he thought he saw shadows, sliding like smoke. They twisted and curled as if they were alive, yet they did not move like any ship or creature he knew. It was as if the Dark itself was bending and shaping into forms just enough for his mind to notice before fading again. The beeping turned into a shrill alarm, and the lights on the bridge shifted to red. The captain ordered shields to full power and weapons armed. The crew moved quickly, hands flying across controls, voices raised in clipped reports. The Horizon was a strong ship with thick armor and advanced weapons. Yet Arlen could sense the fear in the humans, fear not of battle, but of something unknown. Humans could fight anything they understood. But this was different. Arlen glanced at Marlowe and saw her gripping her console so tightly her knuckles turned white. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice calm. He told her they would face whatever came together. She gave a small nod, but her eyes stayed fixed on the darkness outside. The viewport now showed shapes moving closer. No two shapes the same. They stretched and melted into each other as they came nearer. Sometimes they looked like twisted beasts with too many limbs. Sometimes like vast hands reaching for the ship, and sometimes like nothing at all, just waves of shadow rolling silently toward them. The captain called over the comms to all decks, telling every soldier to be ready. The sound of boots running echoed through the ship. Weapons clicked and powered up. The hum of the engines deepened as the horizon adjusted its position. Arlen could feel the energy in the air shift, the kind of tense energy that came right before the first shot was fired. He watched as the darkness outside seemed to thicken and pulse like it was alive. And in that moment, he understood something he had never felt before. The fear humans spoke of in whispers, a fear that had no face, no reason, only the heavy weight of knowing something was coming. Suddenly, a loud metallic bang rang through the ship. The deck shuddered under their feet. The crew looked around as the sound came again, louder, like something slamming into the hull from outside. But the sensors still showed nothing solid, just shadows. Arlen stepped toward the viewport, just as something darker than the dark itself flashed past the glass. Too fast to see clearly, only a blur of deep black with edges that seemed to shimmer like broken glass. The captain shouted for all gunners to fire on visual. The ship shook as cannons roared. Bright blasts of energy lit up the mist, but vanished almost instantly, as if swallowed. Through the fading light, Arlen thought he saw eyes. Not like any eyes he knew, but two burning points of pale light watching the ship from the mist. They vanished in an instant, yet the cold feeling in his chest told him they were still there. The bridge fell quiet for a moment. Only the alarms and the hum of machines filled the air. The crew looked to the captain, waiting for his next order, but Rhodes only stared into the darkness. His voice low as he said they were no longer alone, and worst was yet to come. The red lights on the bridge pulsed like the slow beat of a dying heart, and the sound of the alarm drilled into the ears of every person standing at their stations, while outside the thick black mist moved like liquid shadows that bent and curled in unnatural ways, and Arlen could feel a strange pull in the air, as if the very space around them was bending and twisting under an unseen weight. The captain gave a sharp command to keep weapons locked on the moving shapes, and the crew obeyed, with quick, tense motions, their hands dancing across controls and targeting systems. Yet the sensors showed no clear image, only shifting blurs of nothing and streaks of interference that crawled across the screens like cracks on glass. Arlen kept his gaze fixed on the viewport, where the shadows grew closer each moment, sometimes vanishing as if they had never been there, then reappearing in a different place, and the effect made it hard to breathe, because it felt like they could appear anywhere at any time. Ensign Marlowe whispered under her breath that the shades were here, and that once you saw them it was already too late, and Arlen asked what she meant, but she only shook her head and stared ahead with wide eyes that reflected the red light like polished stones. A heavy thud shook the ship again, making the deck tremble under their boots, and the sound was followed by a high-pitched scraping noise, like metal being torn apart slowly and painfully. The captain ordered damage reports, but the lower decks answered with static, broken voices and silence. Arlen moved to the side of the bridge, near the tactical officer who was tracking the movement outside, and he asked if they could fire a spread into the dark to push whatever was out their way. The officer replied that the dark seemed to eat their shots, as if nothing reached the target, and that even the energy readings vanished before impact. Another thud came louder this time, followed by a flash outside the viewport. A shadow slammed against the hull, and for a brief moment, it took shape, a figure taller than any human with limbs that bent at wrong angles, its surface like liquid metal, yet somehow darker than the void around it. Then it melted back into the mist, leaving a faint ripple behind. The captain raised his voice, calling to all gunners to fire on any visual target, no matter how brief, and the horizon answered with a roar of cannons and streams of plasma that lit the darkness for a heartbeat. Yet every bolt and beam dissolved into nothing the moment it touched the mist, and even the explosions looked swallowed like sparks in deep water. The ship's main lights flickered and died, plunging the bridge into emergency red again. The hum of the engines seemed to lower As if the ship itself was being smothered, the communications officer reported that external channels were blocked completely. There was no way to call the rest of the fleet, and that meant they were truly alone inside this endless black sea. Arlen turned his head sharply when a scream echoed faintly through the comm from a soldier somewhere on the lower decks. The scream cut off mid-sound, replaced by static, then silence. The captain ordered the security teams to sweep those areas, but even as he spoke, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping fast enough to make vapor form with every breath. The tactical screens began to flash warnings about hull stress on multiple points, as if something outside was pressing on the ship from different directions. At once the captain muttered under his breath that they were testing the horizon like predators, pushing at prey before the kill, and Arlen realized he might be right. A sudden crash rattled the bridge again, but this time it came from inside the ship somewhere deep in the maintenance decks, and a faint vibration ran through the floor like footsteps far too heavy to belong to any human. The sound faded, then came again, closer this time, moving toward the central corridor. The captain ordered internal cameras to be brought up, but the feed showed nothing, only static and faint distortions like water ripples on glass. Then for a second the picture cleared enough to show a hallway, and in that hallway a shadow stood still in the middle of the light. The shape was humanoid, but stretched tall and thin, with a head that bent sideways unnaturally. The moment the image appeared, it blurred and was gone. Marlowe whispered that the shades were not supposed to be inside yet, and Arlen asked how she knew, but her voice shook as she replied that the story said they could walk through matter itself if the dark was thick enough around them, and that maybe the horizon was already deep enough for that to happen. The captain ordered all security teams to seal the central corridors and double guard the engineering deck, but his voice was cut off when the bridge lights flickered again and the emergency power dimmed, leaving only faint backup panels glowing weakly. The air felt heavier now, as if they were under deep water. A sound like nails scraping across glass echoed from somewhere beyond the walls, and it moved along the ship's length, slow and deliberate, like something circling them. The captain gripped the console and ordered silence across the bridge. No one spoke, no one moved, and even the hum of the machine seemed quieter as they listened. Then the scraping stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but the soft hiss of the air systems and the distant thrum of the engines, until a loud, sharp knock rang against the glass of the viewport, making everyone jump. The sound was not an impact like before. It was precise, 3 slow taps, as if something outside was knocking to be let in. Arlen stepped forward before anyone else and peered into the mist, pressing his silver hand against the reinforced glass and straining to see movement for several seconds. There was nothing. Then from the black came a pale face that was not a face at all. It had no mouth, no nose, only 2 hollow glowing points where eyes should be. The moment his gaze locked with those lights, a cold voice whispered inside his head. The voice spoke in a language he did not know, yet somehow understood. It said, "You are not human, but you will die like one." Arlen staggered back, clutching his head as the lights faded from view, but the whisper stayed, echoing deep in his mind. The captain barked for the shields to be pushed to maximum and for the engines to reverse, but the helmsman said the ship was not responding fully. The controls felt sluggish, as if something was dragging them backward through thick mud. The readings showed they were still moving forward into the dark, no matter what the engines tried to do. The scraping sound returned, louder now and closer, and then with a deafening crash, the wall at the far end of the bridge dented inward like something massive had struck it from the other side. The metal groaned under the strain, but did not break. Yet every person in the room knew it was only a matter of time before the shades found a way through. Marlowe's voice was barely more than a whisper as she said, "Once they are inside, they will not stop." The captain looked at Arlen, and in that look there was no need for words. They both understood that this was not a fight the horizon was meant to win. This was survival in its rawest form. Outside the viewport, the mist shifted again, and dozens, maybe hundreds of faint, glowing eyes appeared all at once surrounding the ship on every side. They did not move closer. They simply watched, unblinking, the red lights of the bridge reflected in those eyes. And for the first time, Arlen felt something he had never felt before, not even in the worst moments of battle with his own people, a fear that reached deep into the bones and stayed there, whispering that the darkness was patient and that it would wait as long as it needed to until they were ready to fall. The emergency red glow painted the faces of the crew like ghost masks, and the air on the bridge felt heavier, as if the dark had reached through the hull and wrapped itself around every breath they took. The silence outside was worse than the alarms and worse than the scraping, because it meant the shades were still there, just waiting and watching without moving. Arlen stood near the viewport staring into the shifting black mass that surrounded them, and he felt like it was staring back, yet no eyes were visible. Now, only the slow curling of shadow against shadow. The humans on the bridge moved in sharp, nervous motions, their voices low, their hands never stopping as they checked weapons and controls again and again, even though they knew the systems could not keep the dark away. A faint vibration ran through the deck beneath his boots, and he looked toward the captain, but Rhodes was already glancing toward the floor, as if he felt it too. It was a slow, steady pulse like a heartbeat, but not from the ship's engines, and the sound seemed to echo inside their bones more than in the air. The tactical officer tried to trace it, but the sensors showed nothing at all. The comms crackled to life with a burst of static, and then a voice came through, not human and not entirely sound. It was as if thought itself had turned into noise and forced its way into their ears. The words were broken, yet clear enough to send a shiver across the bridge. They said, "You have entered our hollow sky, and you will not return." Arlen felt the same cold presence in his head as before, and he realized the voice was not using the ship systems at all. It was speaking straight into their minds. Marlowe gripped her console and whispered that they should leave now, but the helmsman replied that the engines still resisted, as if something outside was holding them in place. The captain ordered all remaining power to be pushed into drive, but the ship only groaned under the strain, and the black outside seemed to thicken in answer. The lights flickered again, and for a moment the red glow was replaced by near darkness. During that moment, Arlen caught sight of something moving down the far hallway that led away from the bridge. It was tall and thin, its body bending in slow, deliberate motions like it had no bones, its shape blurred, and yet his mind still registered it as wrong. And before he could say anything, the lights came back, and the hallway was empty. He turned back to the others, but no one else seemed to have noticed, so he stayed silent, knowing that telling them would not help and might only feed their fear. The crew already looked strained, their movements sharper, their breathing quick. The human instinct to fight was still there, but it was beginning to mix with something heavier, the knowledge that they might not win this. A sudden crash came from deep within the ship, followed by the sound of metal twisting and tearing. The security teams reported over comms that sections of the lower decks were sealing themselves without command, as if the ship's systems were responding to threats on their own. The captain asked what kind of threats, but the only reply was gunfire echoing faintly over the channel, then static and silence. Arlen's alien senses were sharper than human hearing, and he began to notice something under the alarms and the hum of the ship, a faint chorus of whispers, so soft that they felt more like a breath against the skin than sound in the air. The whispers seemed to speak in many voices at once, none of them using words he could recognize, yet somehow they carried meaning. They spoke of hunger and of watching and of the patience to wait for the right moment to strike. Marlowe leaned closer to him and asked if he heard them too, and when he nodded, she swallowed hard and turned her gaze back to her console, her fingers shaking slightly over the controls. The captain gave the order for all soldiers to retreat toward the upper decks and hold the choke points near engineering and the bridge. He said the shades could not be allowed to reach the power core, or the ship would be done for. The tactical officer reported faint movement inside the ship. Now multiple signals, too quick to track their positions, changing faster than the sensors could lock on. Arlen understood the danger. Immediately, they were already past the hull and moving through the horizon like smoke through cracks in stone. A sharp metallic clang rang out from the wall behind the captain, and the crew spun toward the sound. Weapons raised, a bulge began to form in the reinforced metal, pushing inward with slow force, as if something outside was pressing a single point, until it gave way. The captain shouted for everyone to open fire on that spot, and bright bolts of energy tore into the wall. The metal sparked and hissed, but the bulge stopped moving for the moment. Then the whispers grew louder, and the bridge felt colder. The viewport fogged slightly at the edges, as if frost was forming on the inside, and the shadows outside shifted again, this time curling closer around the ship like hands gripping prey. Arlen's breath came slower, heavier. He could feel his heartbeat thudding against his ribs, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood what fear could do to a mind. It was not the sudden shock of danger, but the slow, unending pressure of knowing it would not stop until it broke you. The comms lit up again with another voice transmission, this one human, and panicked a soldier from the lower decks, shouting that they could not see them, but they were everywhere. His words were cut off by a loud, wet sound, and the channel went dead. The bridge fell into silence after that, except for the alarms and the steady low hum of the dying engines. The captain's face hardened, and he told the crew to prepare for close-quarters combat. He knew that once the Shades were inside, there would be no chance to push them back out. The fight would be to hold ground. As long as possible, Arlen stood taller and readied his plasma rifle. As people did not often fight on the front lines, but in this moment, he felt something pull him forward. Perhaps it was survival, perhaps it was the strange loyalty humans inspired in him. From the corner of the viewport, he saw a ripple in the dark, and then another, until dozens of them moved at once. The shapes still had no true form, yet the mind insisted on trying to see one. Sometimes they looked like beasts, sometimes like human figures, and sometimes like nothing. But the more you looked, the more you realized they were all wrong in ways you could not explain. They were not meant to exist in the light. A heavy boom shook the bridge again, and this time it came from above, dust falling from the ceiling panels as the sound of tearing metal echoed overhead. The captain barked for shields to be redirected upward, but the systems answered slowly, the lag in response, making every second feel too long. The dark outside seemed to pulse in rhythm with the impacts, as if the Shades were beating against the ship's wall rather than its walls. The whispers in Arlen's head became a single clear thought, not his own. It said, "We are inside already, and you cannot stop us." He tried to push the voice away, but it stayed curling like smoke through his mind until it was impossible to tell where his thoughts ended, and the voice began to bridge. Crew looked tense and restless, yet no one abandoned their post, their eyes sharp on the captain, waiting for his next order. The captain raised his head slowly and told them all that they were going to hold here, no matter what, and that the ship's survival depended on their discipline. The crew answered with a unified acknowledgement, but in their voices Arlen could hear the quiet tremor of people who knew what was coming and accepted it because there was no other choice. The dark outside shifted once more, and in the brief flash of emergency light, Arlen thought he saw 1,000 pale points of light staring in from the black, all unblinking, all fixed on the horizon, like predators watching prey. Trapped in a cage, the image burned into his mind, and he knew then that the fear would not leave, even if they escaped. The first impact came like a thunderclap that rattled the entire bridge, and the lights dimmed as power surged through the emergency systems. The crew braced themselves against the consoles, and the deck under their feet groaned, as if the horizon herself felt the pain of what struck her above them. The sound of tearing metal screamed through the corridors, followed by the low echo of something sliding through the bulkheads like water moving through cracks. The captain shouted orders to seal all upper access points, but the system lagged again, the delay stretching seconds into an unbearable eternity, and the crew knew that whatever was coming through would not wait for doors to close. The sound of boots hitting the deck echoed from the hallway as the first wave of soldiers ran to meet the threat, their rifles humming with energy, their armor plates catching the red light in jagged reflections. Arlen gripped his plasma rifle tighter and moved to stand near the choke point at the rear of the bridge. The humans beside him were silent now, their breathing deep and steady, their eyes locked on the hallway, where the shadows had begun to move in ways that made the air itself seem to bend. The emergency lights flickered, and for a heartbeat the shadows took shape, forming tall, twisting figures with limbs too long for any natural body, and then they dissolved back into the black. The first shade stepped through the doorway without sound, its body a shifting column of darkness that pulsed like a living thing. The nearest soldier fired a burst into its center, and the light from the plasma bolts flared inside the creature like fire. Trapped under ice, the shade recoiled, but did not fall, and in the next breath it was upon him, tendrils of shadow curling around his arms and pulling him from the line. His scream was short and sharp, and then cut off as his body vanished into the dark. The rest of the squad opened fire, and the air filled with the bright flash of energy bolts, the smell of scorched metal, and the deep, unnatural chill that radiated from the shades. Arlen aimed for the center mass of the nearest one, and kept firing until the form unraveled into smoke and faded, but the gap it left was filled instantly by another, as if the dark was endless, and each death meant nothing. The captain's voice rang clear over the noise, telling them to hold the line, and by time for the lower decks. To reinforce the bridge, Arlen saw Marlowe moving between consoles, her hands dancing over the controls as she rerouted power to the shield systems and sealed off every remaining corridor behind the defenders. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with focus. She was not fighting with a weapon, but she was still holding the line in her own way. The shades pressed harder now, their movements faster, their shapes flickering between forms that the mind tried and failed to understand. Sometimes they seemed solid enough to block a bolt, and other times the shot passed through them like smoke. Their tendrils lashed out at the defenders, pulling at weapons, tearing at armor, dragging soldiers toward the swirling mass of darkness that now filled the hallway like a rising tide. A loud crash came from above, and part of the ceiling gave way, showering the deck with sparks and fragments. Two more shades dropped through the opening, moving with a fluid grace that made them seem more like predators than soldiers. The rear line shifted to face them, and Arlen found himself turning to cover Marlowe. As one of the creatures lunged across the consoles toward her, his rifle fired at point-blank range, and the flash lit the bridge in a blinding glare. The shade convulsed and dissolved, leaving only the stench of cold metal in the air. The battle felt like it stretched for hours, though only minutes had passed. The defenders fought in tight formation, each soldier covering the others while retreating a step at a time toward the core of the bridge. They could not push forward against the endless wave, but they would not break either. The humans fought with a stubborn fury that Arlen had never seen in any other species. Every movement was deliberate, every shot precise, every step backward taken only when the front line demanded it. Then a sudden, deep hum filled the air, and Arlen realized it was coming from the hull itself. The dark outside was pressing harder than ever. The viewport showed the swirling black pressing flush against the glass, as if it wanted to pour through the transparent barrier. The emergency lights flickered again, and the bridge was thrown into near darkness. In that half-light, he saw hundreds of small points glowing within the black, each one a pale, unblinking eye watching them. The captain ordered the viewport shutters sealed, but the mechanism jammed halfway, leaving just enough of the outside visible to remind them that they were surrounded. The shades on the bridge seemed to pulse in time with the black outside, as if they were drawing strength from it. And for the first time, Arlen felt the edges of his mind strain under the weight of their presence. The whispers returned, low and insistent, speaking of surrender and inevitability. Marlowe shouted that she could give them 10 more minutes of shield power if they could hold the line that long, and the captain answered with a single order to hold at all costs. The crew responded with a renewed burst of fire, the rifle fire and plasma bolts painting the bridge in strobing flashes that made the fight seem unreal. Arlen's shoulder burned as a tendril grazed him, leaving a deep cold that sank into his bones, but he kept firing until the creature fell apart around him. The soldier to his left went down under another shade, and Arlen stepped into the gap. Without thinking, his back pressed against the console as he fought to keep the dark from advancing even an inch. Above the chaos, the deep hum in the hull rose to a low roar, and then a shudder ran through the horizon, so strong that it knocked some of the defenders to their knees. The dark outside rippled, and the shades inside hesitated for a fraction of a second. Arlen did not know what had caused it, but he knew they had to use the moment, and shouted for the others to push back with everything they had. For a brief time, they gained ground, forcing the shades toward the ruined hallway, their bolts tearing through the creatures faster now, as if something beyond was weakening them. But the moment passed too quickly, and the dark surged forward again, filling the space they had cleared. As if mocking the attempt, the captain's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady, telling them they could still hold, and that reinforcements were on their way. The fighting grew tighter now, the shades almost at arm's reach, their tendrils lashing against armor and pulling at rifles. The heat of the plasma fire mixed with the unnatural chill of the creatures until the air itself felt wrong. Arlen's arms ached from the constant firing, but he did not stop, not when the humans beside him kept moving with the same unyielding determination. Then a new sound rose above the noise, a deep, resonant clang from the far end of the hallway, followed by a flood of bright white light that cut through the red. Emergency glow silhouettes emerged from the glare. Heavy armored soldiers carrying weapons larger than Arlen had ever seen. They moved with purpose, their shots slicing through the shades and scattering them. The reinforcements had arrived, and the bridge erupted in renewed hope. The shades recoiled under the combined assault, their forms unraveling faster, now the pressure in Arlen's mind easing slightly, as if the presence outside had been pushed back. The defenders pressed forward in unison, step by step, driving the dark toward the breach. The captain's voice carried over the gunfire, telling them this was their moment, and they had to push them out entirely. The battle surged toward the hallway, and the noise became a wall of sound, weapons fire, shouts, the hiss of vaporizing metal, the whispering voices in Arlen's mind fading with every shade that fell, until at last the final shadow collapsed into smoke and was gone, leaving the corridor empty, except for the bodies of fallen soldiers and the lingering cold that clung to every surface. The bridge fell silent except for the hum of the ship's systems slowly returning to life. The captain stood tall, though his face was drawn and tired, and told them they had survived the first wave, but the dark outside was still there and would return soon. Arlen looked at the viewport and saw the black mass still swirling just beyond the glass patient as ever, and he knew that the real fight had only begun. The bridge was quiet now, but the silence did not bring comfort. Instead, it felt heavy, as if the air itself was waiting for something. The soldiers stood among the fallen, breathing hard, their armor scorched, and din of the reinforcements had driven the shades back. But Arlen knew it was only a pause, not an end. The black mass outside the viewport still swirled slowly, and every so often a ripple passed through it like a shiver. The captain stood with his hands behind his back, watching that darkness as though trying to read its thoughts. Marlowe was moving between stations, checking systems and locking down the last damaged doors, her voice low as she reported that shield power was at 50% and dropping slower now, but still too fast. If the dark attacked again, they might last 15 minutes, maybe less. Arlen listened as he reloaded his rifle, the click of each round feeding into the chamber steady like a heartbeat. The others were doing the same in grim silence. The hum of the ship's systems felt almost like the calm before a storm. A faint tremor ran through the deck, barely enough to notice, but everyone froze at the sensation. The captain lifted his hand for quiet, and the sound of it came then soft at first, a low, distant moan that seemed to come from the metal around them, not from outside, not from any one direction. It was everywhere. It grew deeper until it resonated in their bones, and then stopped, leaving only the memory of it lingering in the ears like an echo from someplace too far away to imagine. The emergency lights flickered, and for a breath the bridge went black in that darkness. Arlen felt something brush the edge of his mind. Not words, not even a thought, just a feeling of cold curiosity, like a gaze pressing down on him. When the lights came back, the crew was glancing at one another, their faces pale, as though they had all felt it too. The captain gave no order this time, only looking at Marlowe, who shook her head. No systems fault, no power surge. The lights had been steady the entire time. Then it began again, but not with shadows this time. This time, it began with voices, faint at first, drifting in from the corridors like half-remembered conversations. One voice was laughing softly, another was calling a name, and another was whispering words in a language no one knew. The soldiers shifted uneasily, and Arlen realized that each of them was hearing something different. His own voice was the sound of someone from years ago calling him back home, a voice he had not heard since before the war, before he had even met a human. He shook his head and gripped his rifle harder, but the voice grew clearer, the words more insistent, the sense of longing pulling at him. The shades had not entered the ship yet, but they were already inside their minds. The captain barked for everyone to hold their ground and ignore anything they heard, but Arlen could see from the way one soldier stepped toward the door that it was already too late, for some two others caught the man by his arms and pulled him back. But his eyes were blank, his lips moving as if speaking to someone none of them could see. The black outside pressed harder against the viewport, the surface writhing now like something alive. The pale eyes began to appear again by the hundreds, each unblinking, each fixed on the bridge. The voices in their heads rose in volume, matching the rhythm of that movement, until it was almost impossible to tell what was real and what was in their own minds. Marlowe slammed her hands on the console and shouted that she was losing control of the shield modulation. Something was overriding the pattern. From the outside, the captain ordered Arlen and two others to escort Marlowe to the shield core room. 3 decks down, they moved quickly through the corridors, weapons up, but the ship felt different now. Darker, the shadows along the walls seemed deeper, and every doorway they passed whispered to them, sometimes in voices they knew, sometimes in voices that were nothing but static. Arlen ignored them. But one of the soldiers flinched and fired down a hallway. At nothing, the blast lit up the space, but there was no one. There only the sound of laughter fading into the dark. They reached the shield core room, and Marlowe rushed to the main panel, her fingers flying over the controls. She cursed under her breath, saying that the dark had found a frequency that the shields could not block, and if it kept pressing, the core would overload and collapse. Arlen and the others took positions at the doors, keeping their rifles ready as the corridor outside seemed to stretch and bend the floor under them, vibrating with a steady pulse like a slow heartbeat. A faint mist began to roll through the hallway, pale and almost glowing. The soldiers tensed and aimed at it, but the mist did not stop. It slid forward until it brushed against the doorway, and then shapes began to form inside it, not solid, not yet, but almost faces twisting in and out of the vapor, eyes opening and closing, mouths moving in silent screams. Arlen fired into it, the plasma shot cutting a hole through the mist, but it closed again, instantly, as if the wound meant nothing. Marlowe shouted that she needed 30 more seconds, and Arlen fired again, this time with longer bursts. The mist recoiled slightly, and the faces twisted faster. The whispers in his head turned into screams, not of pain, but of rage. The floor shook harder. The ceiling groaned somewhere, far above them. Something massive struck the hull, sending a deep metallic thud through the entire ship. The other two soldiers were firing now, as the mist thickened and began pushing harder against the doorway. One of them swore and stepped back as tendrils reached through the air, curling toward him. Arlen shot the tendrils, and they shattered like glass, only to reform again. Marlowe yelled "done," and slammed her hand on the final control. The shield core flared with light, so bright it filled the room and poured down the corridor. The mist screamed this time, a sound so loud it rattled their teeth and tore at their minds. It fled backward into the dark, the faces twisting one last time before vanishing. The whispers cut off in an instant, leaving a silence so sudden it felt unnatural. Marlowe leaned against the panel, breathing hard, and said the shield modulation was holding for now, but it was only a matter of time before the dark adapted again. They returned to the bridge to find the others in tense readiness. The captain nodded once at Marlowe's report, but his eyes stayed fixed on the viewport, where the black mass still swirled, though slower now. The pale eyes had withdrawn, but the surface still moved with that same patient rhythm. Arlen realized it was not retreating, not truly, it was waiting. The captain said that they had to prepare for the next wave because it would come harder and faster than the first, and the next time it might not be shadows or whispers, it might be something worse, something they could not see or hear until it was too late. The crew listened in silence, their weapons still in hand, their bodies still tense from the fight, and the voices they had heard still echoing faintly in the back of their minds. Arlen looked at the black outside and thought of the way it had touched his thoughts so easily, and he wondered if maybe it was still there somewhere deep inside, waiting for the right moment to speak again, waiting for the next time the lights went out and the silence returned, waiting for the next time they had to stand with humanity against the dark. The quiet after the retreat of the mist did not feel like safety. Instead, it pressed down on the crew like the weight of deep water. Every breath felt slow, every sound too loud. Arlen stood at his post on the bridge, scanning the darkness outside. With a black mass waited. It was not gone, it was not beaten, it was simply watching, and in that watching there was hunger. The captain walked the length of the bridge, his steps steady, his eyes fixed on the main display, as if daring the dark to try again. Marlowe worked at her console, keeping the shield modulation in constant motion. She whispered numbers to herself, her lips barely moving, her fingers tapping the controls in a rhythm that almost sounded like a song. The soldiers checked their weapons over and over, as if the metal and weight in their hands could keep fear away. The air was thick with the smell of burnt circuits and scorched armor, a smell that told the truth about how close they had been to losing everything. The first sign of the next move came in the form of a hum, so low it was almost under hearing. It crawled along the metal of a ship, rising and falling like the breath of something huge and alive. The crew froze, listening, trying to understand where it came from. The captain's signal for all system scans, but the displays showed nothing, no heat, no movement, no ship, no life signs, just the black void outside. Arlen felt the hum in his teeth, in the bones of his jaw. It grew sharper until it felt like it was drilling into his skull. He pressed his hands against his helmet, but it did nothing to stop it. Beside him, one soldier began to sway, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Marlowe swore softly, saying the sound was not passing through the air at all. It was inside the metal, traveling through every part of the ship straight into them. The captain ordered all non-essential systems shut down, hoping to break the path of the vibration. Lights dimmed, consoles went dark. The bridge sank into shadow, lit only by the faint red of emergency strips. Still the hum continued, now joined by a faint tapping sound like knuckles on glass. Soft and slow, Arlen turned toward the viewport and felt the air leave his lungs. Shapes were moving in the darkness outside. Not solid shapes, but outlines that shifted and swayed, as if walking through water. They were tall, far taller than any human, their limbs too long, their heads bent slightly forward, as if listening to something. One of them lifted its head, and where a face should have been, there was only more black. Its surface rippled, and Arlen thought he saw pale lights moving under it like fish under ice. The tapping grew louder, now coming from every wall, every floor panel, every surface around them. The soldiers moved to cover every entrance, their eyes wide, their breath quick. Marlowe whispered that the shield was still holding, but the modulation pattern was starting to show strange spikes, as if something was learning how it worked. The captain told her to change the pattern completely and do it fast before the dark could adapt again. The hum stopped suddenly, the tapping too. For a moment, the silence felt almost like relief. But it was not the relief of safety. It was the kind of silence that happens when a predator stops moving just before it strikes. The main display flickered, showing static, and in the face of a crew member who had died in the last battle, her expression calm, her lips moving though no sound came. The static swallowed her again, and the screen went black. Arlen felt something brush the side of his head like the memory of a hand. It was cold and heavy and gone in an instant. He turned to see nothing there, but he knew it had been real, because Marlowe's eyes were wide, and she was staring at him as if she had seen it too. Then the lights died completely. The bridge plunged into darkness, so deep it felt like falling into a hole. Voices filled the dark, now not whispers this time, but clear and sharp, each one speaking directly into the mind of the listener. Arlen heard his own name over and over, each time from a different voice, some angry, some pleading, some laughing. It was impossible to shut them out. They spoke of things he had done, things he had not done, things he had never told anyone, every word wrapped in the cold weight of the dark. A light flared near the doorway as one soldier fired blindly into the room. The plasma flash lit the space for a breath, and in that breath Arlen saw them, the tall shapes from outside, now inside the bridge, moving between the crew, without touching them, yet their limbs bending at wrong angles, their heads turning far too slowly. The light died, and they were gone, but the voices grew louder until they were almost screaming. The captain's voice cut through it, telling everyone to hold their ground, to stay in position. No matter what happened, the soldiers obeyed, but Arlen could feel the strain in them. He could feel it in himself. The dark was not attacking with force. It was breaking them one thought at a time. Marlowe shouted that she needed someone to escort her to the auxiliary shield controls 2 decks below, because the main system was starting to lag from the interference. Arlen volunteered without thinking. The captain nodded and sent him with another soldier named Harker. They moved fast through the corridors, the darkness clinging to the corners, the hum returning in short bursts like the sound of something sniffing the air. The walls seemed to bend slightly each time the hum rose, the doors groaning as they passed. Halfway to the auxiliary controls, they saw a light at the end of the hall. It was warm, golden, and moving as if carried in a hand. The shape of a figure stood behind it, small and familiar. Arlen froze, recognizing the outline. It was someone he had once known before the war, someone who could not be here, could not be alive. He forced himself to look away and pulled Harker forward, but the other man stopped staring at the light, his rifle lowering slowly. Arlen grabbed his arm and shouted over the hum, but Harker only whispered that his sister was here, and she needed him. The golden light grew brighter, spilling down the hall. The hum now wrapped around it like a song. Arlen dragged Harker backward, forcing him to turn away. The moment the soldier's eyes left the light, he gasped, as if waking from a dream, and stumbled after Arlen. They reached the auxiliary controls, and Marlowe's voice came through the comm, telling them to start the sequence immediately. Arlen worked at the console, while Harker kept watch though his hands still shook from whatever he had seen. The system came online, and a shield pulse shifted, the hum cut off, and the golden light vanished from the hull, leaving only the cold, dim glow of emergency strips. When they returned to the bridge, the captain was standing at the viewport, his jaw tight. He said nothing as they reported, only nodded and told Marlowe to keep changing the shield frequency faster than before. The shapes outside were still there, but further back now, their outlines less clear, as if the dark itself was pulling them away. The crew stood in silence, weapons ready, eyes fixed on the void. They all knew it would return. They all knew the night was not done. It had only broken the first wall inside the ship, and soon it would try for the next one inside them. The void outside was no longer still. It swirled slowly like black smoke caught in water, shapes moving within it, pressing forward only to melt back again, as if waiting for a signal. The crew on the bridge stood in a tight circle, weapons ready, their faces pale, but set with the same resolve that had carried them through every battle. So far the captain gave no order, yet only watched the patterns in the dark, his eyes sharp, as if reading a language only he could understand. Arlen felt the hum return, softer than before, almost gentle like the touch of a cold breeze after a storm. He knew better now. It was never gentle. It was a trick, the first step in opening the last door inside the mind, the one that when broken would let the dark in without resistance. Marlowe kept changing the shield patterns, but her hands were shaking and her voice over the comm was thinner than before. The captain ordered full crew readiness across the ship, corridors locked and sealed, all decks prepared for boarding. No one moved alone, not even for a second. The soldiers nodded, but their eyes darted to the viewport, where the black smoke began to form shapes again, tall and long-limbed, with heads that bent low toward the ship, as if sniffing for weakness. The first strike came without warning, a crash, so deep it felt like the floor buckled under their boots. The shields held, but the force sent a wave through the air, knocking a soldier to the ground before he could rise. A shadow reached through the wall, not breaking it, but passing through like water around stone. Its fingers stretched toward him, and Arlen fired a burst of plasma that lit the shadow from within. For a heartbeat, it twisted and pulled back, leaving only the smell of burned air. Marlowe shouted that the shields were being mapped in real time. The dark was studying every frequency and learning too fast. The captain ordered a manual overload to blast the shield outward like a pulse. The energy wave rippled from the hull, pushing the black smoke back into the void. The crew cheered, but it was brief. The smoke gathered itself and pushed forward again, faster this time. Voices began to fill the bridge, not whispers, not screams, but steady, calm words, each one from someone the crew knew or loved, voices that should have been far away, some even long dead. They spoke of safety outside, of peace, if only the humans would open the door and let the dark. And the captain roared for them to hold their minds together, to remember who they were and why they fought. But Arlen could feel the pressure in his head like a tide pulling at the shore of his thoughts. Parker beside him began to lower his weapon, his eyes glassy. Arlen grabbed him, shouting his name, until the soldier blinked and gasped, as if waking from deep water. The dark was pressing harder now, and every second was a fight to stay awake inside your own skull. Then the lights on the bridge flickered and went out. The emergency strips failed too, leaving them in perfect black. For the first time, Arlen thought he saw the truth of it, not shapes, not shadows, but something deeper, a void so complete it felt like the absence of all things, the loss of every sound, every breath, every thought. It poured into space like a tide, rising around their ankles, moving toward their chests. The captain's voice cut through, ordering Marlowe to trigger the ship core charge. It was dangerous, too dangerous in normal space. But this was no normal fight. The pulse from the core could burn the dark from every deck, but it would also strip away most of their shield for minutes. Afterward, a gamble that could save them or doom them faster. Marlowe hesitated only a second before starting the sequence. The hum inside the ship turned to a roar as the dark felt what they were doing. It pressed harder, now not just at their minds, but against the walls themselves. The metal groaned, the viewport glass shimmered, shapes slammed against it, their long limbs wrapping around it like roots around stone. Arlen and the others fired again and again, their plasma bolts tearing through the dark. But it only slowed, never stopped. The voices grew louder and more desperate, promising anything threatening. Everything. The soldier who had fallen before screamed once and went silent, pulled into the wall as if it had turned to liquid, his rifle clattering to the floor where no one dared reach for it. Marlowe called out that the core was almost ready, but the manual override needed 2 more connections deep in engineering. The captain ordered Arlen and Harker to go while he and the others held the bridge. They ran through the dark halls. The hum, now a constant scream, the air colder than ice. They could see their breath fogging inside. Their helmets' shadows moved along the walls beside them, keeping pace. In engineering, the dark was thicker, almost solid. It clung to the machinery and the floor, making each step heavy, as if walking through deep water. Arlen and Harker forced the last 2 connections into place, sparks flying. The hum inside their heads reaching a pitch that felt like it would split their skulls. Marlowe's voice came through the comm, counting down. They sprinted back toward the bridge, the shadows following faster, now reaching for them. Arlen fired over his shoulder, each shot lighting the hall in strobe flashes, showing glimpses of long limbs and faceless heads. They burst onto the bridge as Marlowe hit 0, and the core pulse exploded outward in a wave of white light. For a moment, the darkness vanished, the shapes shattered into nothing, the voices cut off mid-word. The hum fell silent. Every console lit again. The crew stood frozen in the sudden brightness, their chests heaving, their eyes wide. But it was not over. The void outside still churned, the black smoke thinner now, but still they're circling slowly. The captain ordered them to prepare for the final wave. He knew, as they all did, that the dark would throw everything it had left into this last attack. The crew stood shoulder to shoulder, every weapon charged, every shield relay ready. Arlen felt the fear still there in his chest, but it was different now. It was not the cold weight of the dark. It was a sharp fear that comes before a choice, the kind that lets you stand taller instead of shrinking away, the kind humans had carried into every impossible fight across history. When the dark came, it came fast, a wall of black swallowing the void and smashing into the shields. The crew fired in unison, the bridge lit with plasma and energy burst. The dark screamed, though no sound came from outside, the vibrations shaking the ship like a storm. At sea, Marlowe pushed the shield modulation to its limit. The captain shouted orders over the chaos. Arlen held his ground, firing until the barrel glowed red. The wall of black split under the force of their defense, the shapes inside, it twisting and breaking apart, the void beyond slowly clearing, the hum fading into nothing until there was only the sound of their breathing and the steady tone of shield systems holding steady. The captain lowered his weapon and looked at each of them, his voice low but steady as he said it was done for now. The dark had been pushed back, but not destroyed. It would remember them. It would wait for another chance, and when it came, they would be ready again. Arlen stood at the viewport, looking out at the stars breaking through the last wisps of black, and for the first time since it began, he felt the space around them was theirs again, not safe, not forever, but theirs.